In her 78 years, 9 months and 8 days on this earth, my grandmother definitely never lost her sense of humor, even towards the end. She was called many things throughout her life: daughter, sister, aunt, wife, mother, grandmother, teacher, friend, Ms., and the self-proclaimed Steech. This was a woman who came from nothing to achieve so much and overcame tremendous obstacles and heartache, but not once did I ever hear her complain because she knew there were others worse off than herself. The things she wanted us all to remember the most were the good times, how much she loved her family and friends, the annual family reunion, cards for all occasions, birthdays, anniversaries, and thank yous, kindness, power of faith and prayer, her love of birds and art, and NCAA basketball. Go Blue Devils!
Singler step back three!
And of course, a sense of humor. Grandma was a music teacher by trade, but the lessons did not end in the classroom. The greatest thing she ever taught us was that it is okay to say, "I love you." A few days before she died, as she was slipping in and out of consciousness, she turned to my father, her son, and said, "It has been a good life." This is her story. Okay, when you hear the name Betty Lamona Hayden Hartman, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Perfect. Perfection. She's everything that I always wanted to be.
She's my big sister.
Well, I think of someone very caring, but I also think of a woman that was very accomplished at a time when women often didn't play the roles that she did.
Betty was born into a family that already had 5 kids. And we were already hungry and there was no money. And we didn't need her. But we got stuck with her anyway.
The year was 1931. Herbert Hoover was president, and the nation was 2 years into the Great Depression, with an unemployment rate of 16%, well on its way to the height of 25% in 1933. The average annual income was $1,858. A house cost $6,796. A new car, $640. And if you wanted to send a letter, well, that would be 2 cents. 1931 also marked the opening of the Empire State Building in New York City. The Star-Spangled Banner became our national anthem. Al Capone was sentenced to 11 years for tax evasion. The great inventor Thomas Alva Edison passed away, and Alka-Seltzer goes on sale. In the sports world, the St. Louis Cardinals were tops in baseball, the Green Bay Packers in football. Northwestern brought home the NCAA basketball championship, and a horse by the name of 20 Grand won the Kentucky Derby. But in the township of Brooklyn, PA, there resided Lindaville, where on August 4th, 1931, Betty Lamona was born to Hallie and Lita Hayden.
She was born in a house we lived in a little place called Lindaville, which is, and sometimes it's called Max Corners. It's the main intersection of 2 dirt roads up in the hills, probably directly north of Nicholson and west of Hot Bottom and south of Brooklyn. And it's the main 4-corner intersection in that little region. The actual address was Hot Bottom. That was where we got our mail, was in Hot Bottom. And if you wanted to send us mail, you just address it, Hallie Hayden, Hot Bottom, PA. That was it. And it got to us.
The Haydens were a large family, with Betty being the 6th out of 7 children. They were not rich by any means, but what they lacked in monetary terms they made up for with love, laughter, and music. Hallie I. Delbert Hayden was the patriarch of the family, born in Pleasant Mount, Pennsylvania in 1892. He would have many professions throughout his life, including the Coast Artillery in the U.S. Army, machinist, coat hanger manufacturer, and watch repairman.
My dad was kind of an unforgiving type of a person. He was always right. And I don't know where my stubbornness came from, but it might have something to do with him.
My dad was a sixth grade, his education ended at sixth grade, but he taught himself a lot of stuff. He could do the New York Times crossword puzzle with an ink pen and no erasures, and was very, very strict on our education and upbringing.
By the time I can remember our dad, he was a lot better to me than he was to my older brothers and sisters, I guess. But he was kind of a tyrant at times, according to them.
Lida Minnie Cooley was the matriarch, born in Blooming Grove, New York in 1898. And they would be married on April 3, 1916. She too had numerous jobs, including teaching piano, factory worker, and nanny.
She was, again, another self-taught person in many ways. Learned music. She became a piano teacher, and for many years that was the way we got our food, was through Mom's piano lessons.
Well, she was extremely talented. In almost anything she took her mind to do, she could do. And bless her heart, she always said that that was my personality. I believe you could do anything you made up your mind to do, you know, that type of thing, which is probably true.
Our mother was a very loving person, and she was a perfect mother, I always thought. You know, how mothers are sometimes, they're just, you just think they're the perfect mother.
Here's one I really want to ask you. Did Mom really like you best or love you best?
I don't think so, but that's what Betty always said.
Tell us about your sister Carol.
Well, Mom liked her best.
Hallie and Lita have 7 children in all between the years of 1917 to 1933, 4 boys and 3 girls. The firstborn was Edward Ledette in 1917, then Lucille Agnes in 1918, Hallie I. Delbert Jr. in 1921, David Carl 1922, Oliver Wendell 1927, Betty Lamona in 1931, and the baby, Carol Joyce, in 1933. With 7 children spread out over 16 years, there was a bit of a divide and a lot of hunger.
There were 2 sets of children. There was Ed, Lucille, Hallie, and David, and then there was Ollie and Betty and Carol. But the oldest group really had to help take care of everybody else. And one of the things that my mother did was to bake 12 loaves of bread every other day to feed the family. Money was not talked about. I mean, we knew we didn't have much, but nobody said, oh, those poor Haydens, they're poor. It just, you didn't talk about salaries, you didn't talk about what you had or what you didn't have. It was just, that was your life. That was your lot.
You keep saying your dad was away. Where would he go?
Good question. He evidently went where the work was, because somehow we would get money enough for somebody to go to the local grocery store and get something for supper that night to buy. You know, that's the kind of, it was a hand-to-mouth existence.
A short time after Carol was born in 1933, Hallie lost his job at the coat hanger plant in Montrose. So in 1935, at the age of 4, Betty and the entire Hayden family packed up and moved from Lindaville to Nicholson, Pennsylvania.
It was in October, and it was raining. And it was a pretty good rainstorm. It was not a very nice day to move, but we did. We moved anyway. In probably a horse and wagon, I don't know.
When we first moved there, we lived on High Street. And this was 2 houses away from the and when I say the Catholic Church, I mean that. There was one Catholic church. There was also one Methodist church. There was also one Baptist church. There was also one Presbyterian church. And a Holy Roller church. No synagogue. We had one Jewish family. There were no blacks. We had no idea what African Americans were, or at that time they would be known as Negroes.
Why did you move to Nicholson?
Job opportunities for Daddy.
So there were lots of watch type job opportunities there?
No, but he had his shop was on what is called the Trail, which we decided the other night is Route 11. And it was a direct line between Binghamton and Scranton. And about halfway, I think. And so people could leave their watches, their clocks. Daddy could fix them. They'd come back and pick them up, that type of thing. So it was because of the location and where he had a shop, because where we lived was not near the shop at all. But also Nicholson was a very small town. I mean, you could walk to any place in 5 minutes.
And what was it like growing up in Nicholson? Was it a great place to grow up?
Absolutely. It was a small town experience. You know, you had your town drunk, you had your town lawyer, you had your feed store, your lumber mill, you know, all of the things that make a town complete. Gas station, holy cow.
Do you know roughly what the population was there growing up?
I think it was 1,200. Because they used to say things like, oh, wait a minute, population, there was a sign outside town that said, population 1,000, hospitality for 1,000,000.
What was there to do in Nicholson?
What was there to do? Okay, that was our second house. The third house was not very far away from the second house, but it was up on a little embankment, and there was a stone wall. I can still see Carol and me as we sat on that stone wall on a Sunday afternoon with a pad of paper and a pencil, because we were all of us going to be teachers anyway. And we'd write down license plates. I mean, is that like watching paint dry? So that's small town Pennsylvania. Our family was always musical. There was just, it was our entertainment. We didn't have television. And in the early days, we didn't even have radio. So singing was just part of who you were.
From an early age, Betty was destined for a life of music. It was so ingrained in her being. Her major influences were her mother Lita and her father's sister, Aunt Sadie. Both played piano and would help cultivate this talent in Betty.
And my mom also, and I don't know how she got her start with the piano, but she taught piano. And then when the WPA project came along, she taught piano and was paid by the government. So there were always piano students coming in and out our door.
How did you take up the piano?
Well, my mother would teach a student, and they would go out of the house. As soon as the house was quiet, I would sit down and play what that person had just played. I could play anything by ear. So when I had to learn to read music, it was a very painful process.
Our Aunt Sadie was a very good musician. Some people said that Mom was the piano teacher, but Sadie was the real teacher. And Mom and Sadie did a lot of musical conversation with each other. Sadie was more a popular music person, and Mom was a classical. And one of the reasons she didn't like us to go and visit the other families was because she didn't want us to get exposed to this awful popular music. We shouldn't, that shouldn't be part of what we did. We should be into Beethoven and Mozart. But the music was, oh, we sang in the choirs, all of us. We were required to. So we could read music before we could read words, almost literally. It was just part of what we did.
She took violin lessons when she was quite young. And she would, she'd practice with our mom. Mom would sit and play the piano, and Betty would play the violin. And she would get really upset every once in a while. She wouldn't want to practice for Mom. And so she'd play this little ditty, and it was a song that she made up, and I think it went da 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 da, and she'd just play that over and over and over. And finally our mom would just walk out, and of course that's what Betty wanted, was to stop playing. She was a character.
Betty would take up the flute later on, much to her mother and sister's delight. Even with all the instrumental knowledge she would gain over a lifetime and use throughout her career as a teacher, her one true instrument would always be her voice.
She just has the most beautiful voice, and I was always a little envious of her, but at the same time I was appreciative of her voice too.
It's like she didn't just sing, you know. Betty was a real singer. She studied voice, I'm sure, and she took her singing very seriously and became very, very accomplished as a singer. She was very motivated, and when she wanted to be good at something, she went after it, and she put a lot into becoming good at something. I mean, also she had great natural talent, but besides that, she developed her talent. And again, that's very inspiring to have somebody who takes their gifts and really, really develops them.
Nicholson High School, grades 1 through 12, housed in one building, and Betty's graduating class in 1949 would have only 11 students total. What was school like for you in Nicholson?
It was my salvation. You know, I could go there every day and escape whatever was happening at home. And it wasn't, I don't know that I really thought about it that way. It was just, it was something you did. And I loved school. I mean, I could have the worst sniffles in the world, but that wouldn't keep me home. You know, I really, truly loved school. And I did want to be a teacher.
The road to Betty's lifelong dream of teaching music would not be an easy one. Challenges that would arise would be the family's ongoing poverty, a world war, and a debilitating illness that had fallen upon her father. Yet she would persevere.
I don't remember it coming on gradually. My recollection is that I can still see him on the second floor of the second house we lived in Nicholson, in bed. And he spent 2 years plus with severe arthritis.
With her dad being bedridden, this left only Lita to make ends meet for the family. Since most of the other siblings had left the house, this meant the girls had to play caretaker.
My mom worked for Endicott Johnson in Tunkhannock, Pennsylvania. And they posted a job for, I think it was a housekeeper governess position in Endicott. And Mom thought that she should go for it. And she got that job. So now she was working full-time away from home, and Carol and I had full responsibility for taking care of the fires, for getting Daddy's lunch. I mean, all of the home activities, especially during the week. She didn't have to work every weekend, as I recall. But anyway, you know, we had a lot of responsibility. Daddy smoked, and so in this day and age, this is kind of weird to think about, but those of us who were at home were all pretty much enlisted by him to roll his cigarettes. Is that wild?
Betty maintained good grades and was involved in many extracurricular activities, including band, chorus, yearbook committee, church choir, youth group, and varsity basketball.
We did not use profane words. We just didn't. We never heard it in our home. But when I was playing basketball, for some reason, when I would miss a shot, I'd say shit. And my dad, I still don't understand how this happened, but my dad attended a game at one point. And the reason I say I don't know how that happened was how could he afford it? And his health was so poor, but somehow he got to a basketball game. Anyway, after the game, he suggested that maybe I clean up my language.
Wait a minute. Steech?
Betty was Betty, except that I didn't like the fact that I didn't have a nickname, so I made one up for myself.
And what was that?
Steech. I have no idea where it came from.
You can't make up a nickname for yourself.
Well, but I did. And it was funny how it stuck.
In May 1949, I was chosen May Queen and was crowned such with the crown of carnations, wearing a long white gown, holding court over the maypole dancers. My crown bearer was none other than my nephew, Dale Hayden.
And what year did you graduate high school?
1949. I was one of the 49ers.
I was also chosen an outstanding senior and had to prepare and give a speech at graduation. It was an absolutely terrifying experience. It was to be memorized, but I could not do it. They finally allowed me to read it. If I could have put it to music, I would probably have been okay.
What finally got him out of bed?
The doctor came to see him every once in a while. And I can remember him crying with pain. You know, it had to have hurt. But there just wasn't much they could do. And I remember that the doctor was there, and he said to my dad, if you're going to get any better, Hallie, it's up to you. I can't do anything more for you.
He had arthritis very badly and was down in bed with it for a while. They finally got him up by telling him that if he didn't get up and get moving, he was going to just lie there and die. So he decided to get up and start moving.
And that was the first that most of us realized that you can do a lot for yourself if you have certain afflictions.
So you just got up one day and...
Not really. Took a long time, you know, for him to be able to get up and walk and go from one floor to another. At that point, it was late in my elementary education, if not junior high.
And I don't know how many years he was in bed, but I can remember being in 2 different houses when he was right down in bed.
He wasn't in bed all the time when we moved to the other house, come to think about it. But it was like his excuse to not do things. And so he made his home the bed, because that's how it had been for a long time. And then he started to do little things with his hands. And he went back into fixing watches again.
Betty wanted to be a music teacher, and then cousin Harry went to Mansfield and got his degree and became a music teacher. And Betty wanted to follow in his footsteps. And, that is what led her into what she did almost all of her life.
But I always wanted to be a music teacher, and I couldn't see how that could ever happen. When I was in high school, I babysat for our town veterinarian and his wife, their 2 children. They lived across the street from us, which, if you could possibly imagine, a mansion-type place across from, it wasn't a shack. It was a nice, sturdy house. In my senior year, Doc said to me when they came home one night from a dinner outing, we understand that you would like to be a music teacher. And I said, yeah, but there's no way. And he said, well, Marge and I have been talking about this. We want to see if we can figure out some way for you to live your dream. And so the next step was that my mom and dad went down and talked with them. So when they came back, both Mom and Daddy said, the Locks would like to see you have a college education. And what they're proposing is that they will loan you the money to go interest-free, but you have to pay back, you have to teach, and you have to pay back the loans before you get married. I didn't have a school in mind. I mean, there was no way I could go to college, so I hadn't applied for any scholarships or anything. Well, long story short, we got right on the stick and started applying to different schools. So I was accepted at Penn State, the University of Pennsylvania, Temple, and Mansfield. And we decided that Mansfield would be the best place because the student-teacher ratio would be more like what I was used to. And so Mansfield wanted me, and they were willing to give me a pretty good scholarship. My dad took out an insurance policy. I think it was for $1,000 or $2,000, so that if anything happened, there would be some money for them to pay back the loan. Is this funny to talk about in 2010? Hoo-wee.
Why did you want to become a teacher?
Oh, I always loved music. I always was singing or playing or whatever. And I guess the thing I always wrote down about why I wanted to do that was because I always liked to help others. And teaching is helping others.
Thanks to the kindness of a neighbor, off to Mansfield Betty went to pursue her lifelong dream. She would enter as a freshman in the fall of 1949 and graduate with her teaching degree in the spring of 1953. So, what was the Mansfield experience like for you?
Well, in some ways it was a little bit overwhelming. I got very homesick because I had never been away from home that long. Maybe a week in the summertime with an aunt and an uncle, not with people in a dorm room, that I really didn't know. And I wasn't sure I wanted to know sometimes, So, but the classes were stimulating. My music classes were very, very good because I was very, very good in that subject. And I played in the band. I played in the orchestra. I played flute in the band. I played violin in the orchestra. I sang in the chorus. I sang in small groups. I was in a wind ensemble on the flute. I mean, I don't know when I had time to go to class, if you know what I mean. But I did. Fulfilled all of my obligations. For the most part, it was a really great experience. I'm still in touch with people that I went to college with. I think that speaks for itself.
Betty's senior year was upon her in the fall of 1952 when her mother and father decided it would be best to move from Nicholson to Endicott, New York. Lita had been governess for the Frank Johnson family of Endicott Johnson fame for some time now, and it just made sense instead of making the long commute each week. Even though Lita had been the main breadwinner for a while, Hallie would continue his watch trade in Endicott.
He set up a shop. There on Washington Avenue, there was a house that we were renting, and it had a little separate doorway. Somebody evidently had some kind of maybe it was a candy shop or something in their own home. And so he just took over that entrance for his business. And then we had another entrance that was to our home part of the house.
Graduation day had come for Betty in May of 1953. The ceremony would be held at Mansfield's beloved Strawn Hall, where Betty had performed many times throughout her tenure. She was chosen by her classmates to be the soloist on commencement day. Blanche Crowder would be her accompanist. Her proud mother and father would also be present, having made the trip to Mansfield, all the way from Endicott, for Betty would be the first in her family to graduate with a 4-year college degree. Here's what remains of the George F. Johnson School in West Endicott, grades K through 8. On the same day Betty had an interview and received a contract from the Palmyra School District, her mother Lita had spotted an ad in the paper for a music teacher in Endicott. So she set up an interview, and the rest was history. Betty would begin teaching music, grades 1 through 8, at George F. Johnson in the fall of 1953. The dream had come true.
And I had all of the music. I had all of the vocal music, and I also taught instruments. And I think it was 1/2 day a week I went over to what was then West Corners School, which had grades 1 through 4, and I think it just had, I think they had kindergarten too, but I didn't teach kindergarten. They had one class of 1st through 4th grade. Anyway, one 1/2 day a week I did that. And I had some violin students over there. Talk about a busy job.
So when you finally got teaching, was it everything you imagined it could be?
Oh, it was those first few years were a little bit overwhelming. And then I got married, so it was a combination of trying to juggle teaching and being a homemaker, and then Marty came along. I know that I was pregnant when I was still at George F. Johnson, and then some newer schools and that was in 1959, and then there was some juggling by our music supervisor. And they built a couple new elementary schools. I remember my supervisor saying, if you could choose where you wanted to teach in Endicott, what would you choose? And I chose one of the new schools. And that's where I ended up, at Ann McGinnis, which I liked very, very much.
Next, I'd like to know how you met Grandpa.
Actually, it was through Ollie and Roberta, Ollie's second wife.
And actually, Roberta introduced Marty and Betty. Roberta went to Syracuse University with B.J. Hartman, Marty's older sister.
Somehow it was through those connections that B.J. knew Roberta. Roberta met Ollie, who was just starting to work for WNBF, as I recall. And Ollie started to date Roberta, and then they thought that Marty and I should meet.
Do you remember your first date?
No. You know what it was? It was probably, we probably just met at Ollie and Roberta's, well, at Roberta's, I'll say, because I don't think Ollie and Roberta were an item yet. Because that was quite often what you did. You met in big groups and just sort of hung out together.
Would you say he swept you off your feet?
No. No, he actually had to pursue me because I wasn't a person who dated very much.
It was now 1955, and Betty had been in her dream job for a few years, met the man she would call the love of her life, but with every high comes a low. In May of that year, Betty was checking up on her father in his shop and found him extremely ill and had him rushed to the hospital. Within days, Hallie would pass away from bleeding stomach ulcers and would never have the chance to walk his daughter down the aisle.
Marty Hartman was probably the nicest guy I ever met in my life. He and I became really close buddies. I've never had a buddy since.
He was well-mannered. He opened the doors for her, car doors and restaurants and everything like that.
Chivalrous.
Yes, and that was very important to her.
He's a nice guy. Couldn't be beat. Yeah.
He was great. Funny. And I even took pictures of him, and I recently gave them to you, yeah. He was the greatest, and he loved Betty.
Martin Harold Hartman, born on January 19, 1929, to Martin Levi and Jenny Hartman. He was raised as a middle child in Johnson City with his two sisters, Betty Jane and Edna, and he would develop juvenile diabetes before adulthood, a disease he would struggle with for the rest of his life. His chosen profession was plumbing, and he and his father ran Hartman & Son Plumbing and Heating. It would have been around 1954 when he met Betty Hayden. Can you tell me a little more about Grandpa, like his personality, sense of humor?
Oh, he was funny. Had the best sense of humor. For the most part, easygoing. I think he had a hard time working with his dad because his dad had a drinking problem. He wouldn't know from day to day which father he would have, you know. You could talk to him about any subject. He had a very good vocabulary.
What type of interests did he have? Like hobbies?
Cars. He loved antique cars. And Playboy.
I was going to say, do you see any of the same traits in Grandpa and like Dad or myself?
Yes. Yeah, as a matter of fact, I quite often say how like your grandfather you are, or how like Marty is his father.
In what way?
Well, the traits, there's a warmth, there's the sense of humor, there's the work ethic, all of the good things. I mean that very sincerely, you know,
After almost a year of dating, a proposal would come in the summer of 1955, much to the surprise of one unsuspecting Betty Hayden.
We liked going down to Pennsylvania to see Hallie. Marty and Hallie were like two peas in a pod. They just were really, really close. And so Sunday afternoon, we very often drove down to Nicholson and then came back, usually after dark. And this particular night, we got on one of this, we were taking the back road out of Nicholson up to get up to the main highway. And he pulled over. And I say, oh, okay, what's this route? And he said, I would like to ask you a question. I'm a diabetic, and I know that my life probably isn't very long, but what life I have, I'd like to spend with you. And I remember we were sitting very close together on the driver's side, and I remember just, my body just went whoosh. I got as far away from him as I could, and I'm looking at him like, what is this? You know, I was non-comprehending at that point. And then it was like somebody tapped on my shoulder and said, say yes. And so I don't know whether it was seconds or minutes or whatever the time factor was. But anyway, I realized that probably he was the best I could ever get. I mean, it just was right there. And so I got out of my corner and out of the ice cube I was in and said, I would like that.
With her college loan paid off to Doc Locke, Betty was free to marry, and the date was set, December 17th, 1955, for on this day Betty Lamona Hayden and Martin Harold Hartman would join their lives together in holy matrimony. What was your wedding day like?
Busy. Yeah, we were living on Jackson Avenue. So Carol and Lucille and I don't know how all of us did everything we had to do. And I got ready pretty much there. As I recall, there was some snow on the ground. And the wedding was at First Methodist Church in Endicott. There were a lot of people there.
There would be a lot of people attending their wedding indeed, approximately 200. Betty would be given away by her eldest brother, Ed. Her maid of honor would be her older sister, Lucille. Her bridesmaids would be her younger sister, Carol, and best friend, Nancy Brown. Martin's best man would be his friend, John Van Gordon, and the ushers were Betty's brother, Ollie, and Martin's friend, Joe Zidmel. The Reverend Leon Boughton officiated. Music was provided by soloist Kenneth McDevitt and organist Elwin West. The reception would be held in the church parlor, and the newly married couple would honeymoon throughout the New England states the following week.
Our first home was a furnished apartment in Johnson City. The kitchen was the size of a closet. I kid you not. But anyway, our whole premise was that we were going to build our own house, and we weren't going to pay any more than we absolutely had to for rent and so forth, so that we could save everything for our house. And sure enough, that's what we did, because we ended up building that lovely house on Robinson Hill Road. And
their house on Robinson Hill Road would have been completed around the 1957-58 time frame. Marty and his dad, of course, handled all the plumbing and heating. Now that the Hartmans had their dream home, it would be time to start a family.
Home of the free, yeah. Little big houses for you and me. Oh, yeah, you and me.
August of '58. The late Marty Hartman and his dad were in the plumbing and heating business. And they worked at a lot of affluent homes. So Marty and Pop always did the work on the one, it was the sister of, I think, Charlie Johnson. And she was married to a doctor by the name of Crozier. And so Mrs. Crozier always had them doing her work. And when Mrs. Crozier died, Mrs. Crozier's nephew inherited everything. And he had no need for any of the stuff that he inherited. So he decided to auction off all of the furniture in that house. And in the house was an 1892 Weber grand piano. So the day that it was going to be auctioned, Pop went to the auction, unbeknownst to the rest of us. That afternoon, I had a telephone call And he said, "You're expecting a grand baby in January, right?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, you can expect a baby grand this afternoon." Totally out of the blue. And I was dumbfounded, just absolutely dumbfounded. And the rest, I guess, is history, because that piano has had to fit in every place I've ever lived. I mean, it's just part of who I am, I guess.
The piano was in fact a grand piano, and the grandbaby, Martin Harold Hartman II, would be welcomed into the world by his two loving parents on February 6, 1959.
And he was a big boy, because he weighed 9 pounds, 4.5 ounces. But they had to induce labor, so it wasn't I didn't have a long labor period.
You know, she had a child, and she was very devoted to her child and devoted to her husband, and still acting in a way that she had this, you know, huge extended family, and really cared what happened to them as well. So I perceived her to be a very, very committed parent. You know, today we would say a very actively involved parent, not a parent who just, you know, sort of says, well, let somebody else raise my child.
He was a wonderful child. I mean, he was good-natured. He really didn't like to get into a lot of trouble. And I don't know if it was because he didn't like the punishment or, you know, but he was just a really, really good child. I would go shopping. I said, we, because I would take him with me. We would go shopping in Binghamton. And if I was shopping for clothing, he'd just go under where the clothes were hanging up. He would go under one of those and just lay there and talk to himself or whatever. I mean, you know, he didn't run around and make a lot of noise or anything. He was really, really, really good.
What was it like growing up with Grandma?
She seemed to give me all the attention that I tried to vie for when I wanted it. She was busy. My dad was busy. They were both in church choir, so Thursday nights they would go out. On Thursday nights, I can remember that.
Now, how about when my father was born? Did you see any change in her, or how did she take to motherhood?
Well, first of all, I think we kind of resented him because all of a sudden something was taking up Betty and Marty's time instead of us. We didn't adopt him right away. Because it was kind of, he was really ruining a perfectly good friendship. He's another one of those people that, you know, oh, when he got to be about 3 years old or so, well, he's not so bad. You know?
What was it like for you being an only child?
Wanting a sibling. I know that I wanted a sibling. Also as a result of being an only child, I hung out with a lot of adults probably more than some other kids maybe would have had they had siblings. But I learned how to play Monopoly by myself.
Yes, there was one time when he told me he just wanted to be a regular kid, because I didn't like him to be dirty or, you know, it was just really kind of funny, the things. Can't I just be a regular kid? We thought we would like to have more children. We didn't not try to have more children, but it just didn't work out. And when you've got the best.
Even when he had the best, it didn't mean that he wouldn't slip up from time to time.
I don't even remember where we were. We were going someplace and we pulled over to the side of a street to park, and something happened when little Marty was getting out of the car, and he said, "Oh shit." And I'm sitting in the back seat of the car saying, "Where did that come from?" Knowing very well that it was right out of my mouth.
Evidently, I learned a certain bit of colloquialism that a young person, I guess a young adolescent, shouldn't have known at the age of 3 or 4. Which I actually don't remember that. I remember her saying that word one other time, and I confronted her with it, and she denied ever saying it. That I do remember. So evidently, once you say the word shit, you don't admit to it ever again.
Would you say you're pretty proud of your son and how he turned out?
Oh my goodness. He's my hero. You know, the events of the last couple of years and now this year, it's incredible. He's had a chance to shine where maybe earlier in his life he wasn't, because I was shining, but to me he's been shining big time. And Edna, I think Edna had a chance to tell him that she was so proud of the man that he has become, that his father would have been very proud of the man he's become. I think that's such a great compliment.
Are you reeling in the years, stowing away the time? Are you gathering up the tears? Have you had enough of mine?
Family was extremely important to Betty, and now that she had one of her own, there were so many memories to create throughout the upcoming decade of the 1960s. Throughout the school year, it was typical routine for the Hartmans. Friday night dinners out were commonplace, card playing and choir practice for Marty and Betty on Thursdays. When summer would come, it would be busy for Marty and the business, but there was still family fun to be had.
But the biggest summertime thing probably would be going to Hallie's.
The fact that we went to Nicholson so much says that we had a really good time going down there.
Hallie's was always good. I bet you we probably would visit Hallie's at least 15 to 20 times in a year.
We'd have a picnic and we built a pavilion.
We'd have picnics, swim in the pond, definitely in the summertime. Throw a line in the pond, try and catch a fish or something.
Had a couple mini vacations. We went to Iowa a couple times.
We went out to Iowa once or twice to see the vests. As a family, other times my mom drove, my mother and I drove out there in the summertime.
These summer trips to Iowa would include stops along the way to places like Niagara Falls and the Henry Ford Museum, which included a replica of Thomas Edison's laboratory. What about Hershey?
Hershey, yeah, we did do Hershey. That would always be, for some reason, one of the coldest days of the year to me, but it's outdoors, and my father's love of cars. You could go see the antiques and the flea market and so forth, and just that was a lot of fun.
1963 would be an important year for Betty and the Hartman family altogether. Since 1955, Betty had been working on her master's in music education at Ithaca College through night and summer courses, and she would finally earn that degree in 1963, which was required by New York State for her to continue teaching. 1963 also marked the year that Betty's mother, Lita, would come live with them. She had needed a place to live, and the Hartmans needed someone to look after their son. Lita would live in the top room of the house and help with cooking, laundry, and looking after her grandson, Marty.
My mom came to live with us. That was a dual-purposed thing. She needed a place to live. We needed somebody to help take care of young Marty.
I also think that a lot of it was, I think my mom felt that maybe I needed a different environment because I was in like a daycare. And I actually can remember that I did not like that at all. I was kind of rebelling at an early age.
And so she came to live with us, and that was a big challenge for me because I could see my mother taking over and I didn't know quite what to do about it. You know, we needed her, she needed us, but I saw that she sort of usurped my authority at times. She was the one that disciplined Marty. She was the one that got supper for my husband. She was the one, you know, it was like, I felt like my wifely duties weren't always very important. because she kind of took over.
For a lot of my early years, having my grandmother in the house, my grandmother did the yeoman's work probably from 3 o'clock to 5 o'clock or so, most days.
For Marty, can you imagine having a full-time grandmother in your house? It was wonderful for him. And she taught him, you know, anything she did, he wanted to know how to do. He learned how to crochet, he learned how to cook, he learned how to run his little machines. There was probably some music stuff going on in there too, all the time. But
Even though there were some problems, Lita would stay with the Hartmans for nearly 10 years.
Graham got sick, and she needed to go some rehabilitation recovery time, so they felt if I went with my mother to school, it would alleviate the pressure on Graham to have to deal with me coming home from school.
I was in one school at that point in teaching in Endicott, and decided to see if we could get him into the UE school system.
It would have been part way through my 4th grade year in 1968. School was brand new. So I went to Union-Endicott with my mother for the rest of that year. And it was a neat experience, made new friends. I enjoyed it so much that I convinced my parents that I thought I should go there for another year, and then another year. So I went there until all the way through 6th grade, and came back to Johnson City for 7th. But the unique experience was having my mother for a teacher.
The pinnacle of Betty teaching her son was in 1970 when her choral group performed Animal Songs by Anna Lenti, who was the daughter of Broadway Billy Rose. This was the only time Betty ever felt she showed any favoritism towards her son during his time in her classroom.
It was narrated by Martin Mouse. Well, Martin Mouse was Martin Hartman, and I think there was a little bit of favoritism there. But Anna Lenti also was very, why not have your son?
Who's Anna Lenti, I guess?
She was a composer who wrote a series of songs that she called Animal Songs. And I heard them and I liked them, and through a contact that I had, wrote to see if there was any chance that she would arrange the songs for children's voices and piano, which she did. And then she came up from Long Island to hear the performance and so forth. So, it was a big deal. And boy, that auditorium was packed when we performed it.
What a way to end the decade on a happy note, for the next 10 years would have many trials and tribulations associated with it.
Everything turn, turn, turn. There is a season, turn, turn, turn.
He had juvenile diabetes?
Yes.
What was his attitude towards that disease?
Well, I'm going to say disgusted. It was a horrible disease. You had to watch when you had your meals. You had to be sure to have them on time. And he hated some of that. And so he rebelled. He wasn't a good patient. If he wanted a beer, he had a beer. And he would very often say, "Die young and be a good-looking corpse." As strange as that may sound, and weird and funny, but not funny, he was really saying, I hope you're listening, because I'm not a good patient and I probably will die young.
Betty took a sabbatical year for the 1971-72 term. She was originally going to work on her PhD, but her husband Marty was stricken with a terminal illness, and she decided a PhD would be too much while caring for him, and determined a second master's, This time a performance vocal would be more prudent.
70, 71 in there someplace. He started to show signs of edema. And it wasn't getting any better. And so his doctor said, I don't like this. Let's get you into the hospital for some tests.
The main test they would conduct was a cardiac catheterization, which unfortunately scraped some plaque loose, triggering a minor stroke. 21 days would be spent in the hospital, with Betty being there each and every day. The lingering effects would be weakness on his left side with a slight limp, hanging arm, drooping face, and a broken spirit.
But the weight started to drop off. The edema went away. And then, of course, it was one of my consultations with the cardiologist when he said that he had severe arteriosclerotic heart disease. And they said 6 months to a year is probably what we're talking here. You know, we never discussed the fact that he had a timeline. We never discussed the fact that he had a stroke. One day he said to me, and this was early on in the hospital after he had the stroke, he said, you know, such and such, I don't even remember who it was, said I had a stroke. And he was dumbfounded, completely dumbfounded. And I said, well, yes, that's true.
With what little time Marty had left, the Hartmans were determined to make it count, and they did so in the summer of 1972.
And then we had been talking about saving some money together. Maybe we should spend some money together and make a trip across the country, because that had been a dream of ours from, you know, day one. And Marty loved this country. He loved history. He loved being a patriot, you know. And he wanted to see our country. So we got in our car and started out.
Headed southwest and then along the west coast through the northwest and back east.
Well, anyway, we came back down from Canada to the United States somehow in there.
That's what we did. We'd drive a few hundred miles, and if there wasn't a friend or family, we'd stay in a hotel. You know, within a day, we'd probably be visiting with somebody for a couple days. So that was my dad's goodbye.
The trip would last approximately 6 weeks, with Betty doing all the driving. Marty did suffer one seizure in California, but the Hartmans made it back to Johnson City in August, concluding Betty's sabbatical and just in time for the school year to begin.
It was a routine day. I had my hair done. Shortly after I got home, anyway, he decided he was going to wash the car. And so I was in the kitchen, and I heard this loud sound. I didn't know what the sound was, and I started down the steps. And I said, Marty, are you all right? And there was no sound. So I ran right back up and dialed 911 or whatever we did, called Charlie, our neighbor. I remember saying to Charlie, I think it's too late, something like that. And Charlie came over, and he was the one that really discovered that Marty was gone. Turned out to be, we had a hose that came down from a pipe. Pipe went across, the hose came down, so he could walk around. It was on a swivel, so he could walk around the car to wash it. And what happened was he had a heart attack. And the sound I heard was the pipe hitting pipe.
Your faith was strong, but you needed proof. You saw her bathing on the roof, her beauty and the moonlight overthrew you. And she tied you to her kitchen chair, and she broke your throne and she cut your hair, and from your lips she drew the hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah,
The after effects of Marty's death would be described by Betty as self-destruct. Simply, she was lonely and depressed and had started drinking a lot. This would affect her mothering and her career to the point where she took a leave of absence for a time. She even asked her mother to move out while her life was spiraling out of control. It would take 5 years and a stay in the hospital for a pinched nerve in her right arm before she would hit rock bottom.
First morning I was there, they were seeing things I didn't even see. They realized that I needed some psychiatric help. When I realized it, I said, there's something wrong. There's something terribly wrong. And the doctor would say, would you like us to get you some help? And I would say, I'd like to see my minister first. So they contacted my minister, and he said, I would love to be there, Betty, but I can't. It's Maundy, Thursday, and I cannot get out of my responsibilities until, I think he said 7:30, 8 o'clock that night. Can you hang on? And somehow he gave me the strength to hang on for the rest of the day. And then when he came to my room, he said, we're going to get you out of here right this minute. And he took me to the solarium with the box of tissues and said, okay, tell me what's going on. And I just started to cry. And I cried buckets. And at some point in this, I don't remember all of the questions he asked me, but he said, and when did you realize that Marty died? And I couldn't answer the question. But that's when I said, I guess now I realize. And that was the beginning of my getting back to normal, the healing that needed to go on.
I went through a similar thing.
He did some self-destruct stuff too.
I drank, I dabbled with organic drugs.
It wasn't like we didn't know what was going on, but he wasn't paying much attention to my needs and I wasn't paying much attention to his.
I didn't know that I wanted her to be there. I wanted to be with my friends. I wanted to do my thing. But through all that, God's hand was always on us. I mean, there were some things that happened in my, Grandma's life, some things that happened in my life that, one turn in a different direction, we might not have been here today, or, the whole outcome would have been totally different. No coincidences.
October 1973, nearly a year after Marty's death. Betty was still in the early stages of her self-destruction, but was continuing to work on her second master's and preparing for the performance of a lifetime, her master's recital in vocal performance.
Her master's was going to be for performance, so obviously she had to do something significant, I guess.
It was, again, a cycle of songs by Villa-Lobos called Bachianas Brasileiras.
At least the way it was performed this particular day, it required 8 cellists. So it was quite an affair, but that wasn't the only piece that she performed. There was, I think, 2 or 3 other pieces, some of which were accompanied by piano. I don't know how many people attended. It's interesting, I can remember some of her drinking buddies coming. Mom had a great friendship with these 2 fellows in particular, and they'd never heard. It's funny. They just couldn't believe that these sounds came out of your grandmother's mouth. They were just blown away. And they should have been.
Martin graduated from Johnson City High School in 1977 and entered the telecommunications industry. By 1978, Betty was still coming out of her fog, as she called it, and while doing so, had an opportunity to sing in Europe for 6 weeks during that summer. A group out of Oneonta, New York, called the New York Chamber Choir, invited her to perform with them throughout Europe. Most of the concerts would be held in Switzerland, Betty later noted. Betty's brother, Ollie, who lived near San Francisco, had been trying to get Betty to move out to his area for some time. So at the end of the first half of the 1978 school year, Betty decided to go into semi-retirement and head west to live with her brother. By this time, she had been teaching at the Union-Endicott High School and was well liked by the students and staff alike. The students had even given her the nickname Ms. because it was trendy at the time and to encourage her to move on with her life after Marty's death. So in December of 1978, her beloved students gave her a send-off dinner and she was on her way, driving the 3,000 miles across country by herself. When she arrived at her brother's residence in Marin County, she was surprised to learn that Ollie's wife had just left him, and now she was needed to help in raising his 2 children, Michael and Jai. As it turns out, due to homesickness, her stay would only cover 9 months, from January 1979 to September of that same year. But in that time, she would help Ollie get back on his feet, work as a clerical temp, and her crown jewel, singing in the choir for Beethoven's Ninth with the San Francisco Symphony.
And then she said to me one day, you know, I think I'm going to go over to San Francisco. She read the newspaper. And I think I'm going to go over to San Francisco and try out for the San Francisco Symphony Chorus. And I said, sure, Betty.
And so I made an appointment to go for an audition in San Francisco. And the man who was the director of the San Francisco Symphony Chorus, Louis Mager, was the person running the auditions. And I had prepared a Samuel Barber piece to do. And we got to the end, and he just said, there's no reason for you to go on with this audition. He said, anybody that can sing that piece of music deserves more, or something like that.
And so she went to San Francisco and she tried out for the chorus. Of course, Betty didn't do very many auditions where she lost. Next thing you know, she's going to rehearsals with the San Francisco Symphony Chorus. This is one of the great symphony orchestras in our country.
My experience was that I sang with the San Francisco Symphony Chorus on the stage of the Opera House in San Francisco. And I'd never been on that stage before. I'd never seen an opera in that opera house before. And here I was singing on stage.
And what she was going to do was sing in the greatest of all pieces of music, the Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. So I got a date, and we went to San Francisco and got some nice seats in Davies Hall, and we watched Betty perform in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony. That was, if I have to say what was number one in my entire life, we're right there, right there.
With 2 major performances under her belt during the decade of the 1970s, when I asked Betty what her most memorable performance of all time was, she replied the 3 nativity songs, written specifically for her by Dan Locklear in 1974, and she would go on to perform at numerous times at numerous venues for the rest of her life. Of all the performances you've done in your life, is there one at the top that you would say is your most memorable?
Well, I'd have to say that the Dan Locklear songs, the songs that Dan Locklear wrote for me, has to be way up there just because of the circumstances. I mean, he's now a world-renowned composer. He wrote those songs just for my voice. That kind of blows me away. I remember one incident when I was getting ready to go to bed, and he knocked on my bedroom door, and he said he wanted to talk. And so I was actually in bed, and he came in, he sat on the other side of the bed, and he was telling me that he and Joellen were seriously considering marriage. And the only thing I remember saying to him was, Marty, just remember that marriage is for a very long time. Be sure you know what you're doing. And that was all the advice I had.
In the midst of her California living, Betty returned home for a few days in May of 1979 to celebrate the wedding of her son Martin Harold Hartman II to Joellen Batdorf. Joellen was a student of Betty's, and in the spring of 1977, Betty had her students performing a production of Camelot at Union-Endicott High School. Betty had needed someone to run the audio and enlisted her son's help. In the chorus of the production was a young Joellen Batdorf, and she found Betty's audio guy quite irresistible. Can you describe what you remember of their wedding day?
I remember it was at First Presbyterian Church. I remember a lot of happiness and laughter. I remember the dress I wore. I remember it was a very happy day, yes.
I guess next topic is the birth of your grandchildren. What was that like for you?
Traumatic, good heavens. I was too young to be a grandmother.
The decade of the 80s would start with the birth of Betty's first grandchild, a boy named Martin Harold Hartman III, on August 18, 1980, in Johnson City, New York. Her second grandchild, this time a girl named Jenny Victoria Hartman, would be born in Binghamton, New York on October 20th, 1982.
I definitely know she was there when your mom went into labor with you. There was concern because the labor was being prolonged. Then they started talking about the cesarean section and so forth, and I was a very worried daddy. And she was there.
How do you think she liked having grandkids?
Oh, it was like gold for her. You guys really made her light up.
Shortly after Betty moved back from California for good, she met a man by the name of Tom Rounds at a bar one night. She was still in semi-self-destruct mode, and the two would have a whirlwind romance and marry on February 28, 1982, at First Presbyterian Church in Binghamton.
It was less than a year from the time we met to the time we married. And I didn't really know him well when I married him. He was charming. He wanted to take care of me. And I was at the point where I wanted somebody to take care of me. But I didn't realize that in doing so, I was letting him control my life. And that was a huge mistake.
Tom was a robotics engineer for IBM, and shortly after the marriage, his job required a move to Tucson, Arizona. So Betty sold her house her and Marty built on Robinson Hill Road and packed up with her new husband and moved to the desert out west.
Oh, I loved the desert. Loved living in the desert.
Betty did love her desert living and would earn money as a temp for IBM, but things at home were taking their toll.
I remember crying a lot. Probably as much as I've ever cried. Because I was in Tucson, and Tom traveled a lot for IBM. And it turned out that some of the travel was to see other females, so.
Unbeknownst to Betty, one of those females happened to be in Poughkeepsie, New York, and Tom was able to get a transfer there in 1983. and so the two headed back east. Betty would be able to continue temping for IBM, but got the itch to take up teaching again for the first time since she left Union-Endicott High School in 1978.
There was an article classified about a job in Hyde Park. I was able to get an appointment and went and interviewed for the job. And then a couple days later, I got a call from the head of the music department that they had decided to hire somebody else. And so I was devastated. But then school started and I was at work at IBM. The phone rang and it was the music chairperson who had interviewed me. And he said, "Are you still interested in the teaching job?" And I said, "Is the Pope Catholic?"
Apparently, the woman that they had originally given the job to had another offer closer to where her family lived. Betty told the man she would accept the job, but in classy Betty fashion, insisted on giving IBM 2 weeks' notice before she would start. The school was Netherwood Elementary and resided in historic Hyde Park, New York. Shortly after Betty started her new job, her beloved mother, Lita, passed away from cancer on October 3rd, 1983, at the age of 85.
I can remember going down to Pennsylvania, down to Halley's, because that's where the funeral was. And I remember at the time that I could barely get from point A to point B because Tom was just not a nice person through the whole thing. So I don't know that I probably mourned my mother before her death and then considerably later after her death, just because of the circumstances of my own marriage.
The circumstances of Betty's marriage finally came to a head in 1983, and she would be divorced on April 2nd, 1984. By 1986, she was still teaching in Hyde Park, but had been transferred to North Park Elementary. After renting in several different places for a few years, Betty decided she was going to build a house. To do so, though, she would need a place to live until construction was complete. The answer to her prayers would come from the North Park Elementary librarian.
So kind of kiddingly one day at school, I said to Alice, "Well, you've got lots of room, I'll come and live with you."
I can remember we were both standing in our own doorways, and she was telling me that she needed to find another place to live. And I said, "Well, no problem, Betty, come move with us and live with us." And I called Cornell right away, and he didn't have a problem with it.
I remember when Alice asked me whether or not Betty could come live with us, and we hadn't had anybody that had stayed with us, and I was a little reluctant about having another person come stay with us, but I said, "Oh, go ahead, we'll have her." And I was very pleased that she did come and stay with us, because she was a real help to the household, and the household went better with Betty than without Betty. It was cleaner, and we always loved our Tuesday dinners. She was such a good cook, so everybody looked forward to Tuesday dinners.
I remember getting the news that she was moving in, and in a way it was nice because my brother and sister had gone off to college, so it was another person to be around and talk to. But it was interesting because the two of us had to share a bathroom, and so probably it was, at first, it felt like an invasion. You know, it wasn't like something I was excited about, having to share a bathroom. But Betty made the bathroom smell better. Probably Betty kept the bathroom cleaner than it would have been without her. And very quickly learned that it was a good addition to the family, and it wasn't a bad thing at all.
Betty would stay with the Dawsons in Hyde Park from the end of November 1986 until the school year ended. Sometime during her stay, she decided to forego her house building plans and found a condo to buy in Poughkeepsie. But all along, her passion for music and teaching would thrive at North Park.
But I remember she really related well, not only to the teachers that were, you know, about her age, but to the younger teachers. I mean, to this day, I think they would consider Betty their best friend. She started a couple new programs. She started the Brotherhood Pageant, which was the day before Thanksgiving. All the kids would march into the gymnasium with food items for, you know, just to make up food baskets for needy families. And that's still going on today. But the thing that Betty, because she started it, not only would she sing, she'd have a sing-along afterwards. Not only would she sing some of the more popular Christmas carols, but she also sang some of the religious ones like Silent Night and Oh Come All Ye Faithful. And after Betty left and somebody else had to take over the Brotherhood pageant, they tried to get rid of some of those more religious songs, but it didn't work. We still sing them to this day. We still end with Silent Night.
Could you tell me a little bit about the North Park Notes?
I think she wanted a special singing group. It was both boys and girls. And she used that group to not only have some of the kids who were more talented in that area, but then they used to go on the road. They would sing in the mall. They would sing, I think they even sang for some of the radio stations.
How would you describe like her relationships with the students?
Students liked her. They respected her. I mean, she had some of the largest chorus groups that we've ever had because people wanted to participate and they knew they were going to get something out of it.
As the 1980s drew to a close, Betty's grandkids were getting to the age where they could make the 3-hour ride to Poughkeepsie from the Binghamton area and spend a week with their grandmother during the summer. Activities involved shopping sprees, spending time at the condo pool, and a water park called Splashdown.
Thought it was important for me to bond with them and have each one at a separate time so I could get to know that individual child. So your folks would bring everybody down to Poughkeepsie, and then one of you would stay, and then they'd come back the next weekend, and that child would stay. And then the last summer I was there, when I knew I was retiring, both of you came at the beginning of the summer and stayed the whole summer.
Even though the decade had started on a high note and even saw Betty's return to teaching, in a sense her lowest point, her failed marriage to Tom Rounds, would define the 10-year period and ironically establish some of the greatest experiences and relationships of her life.
Even though I call him a poopy head and it was a terrible existence. I can't imagine my life without that chapter in it because it brought all of these other things that were so positive. So, you have to weigh things in life.
Whoa, the good life, full of fun.
And she was selling her house because she had started to build a place in Greene, New York, because she wanted to move back closer to all of you. And so the house sold, but the place in Greene was not finished. So she came back and lived with us again.
While still teaching at North Park Elementary, Betty sold her condo in Poughkeepsie on July 23, 1991. The reason for the sale was she was building a new home 3 hours away near her family in Greene, New York. She would move into her new house during October and live there on weekends. During the work week, she would stay once again with her friends, the Dawsons, in Hyde Park. What did you think of her decision to build a house in Greene?
I thought that was a good idea. Yeah, it worked out really well. She wanted to be close to you kids, and
it worked out. I mean, she had given up her home in Poughkeepsie and had these wonderful friends who took her in for the year that she was going to continue teaching until retirement.
Due to incentives, Betty decided to retire on December 31st, 1992, halfway through the school year. Now she would be free to live in her new home full-time and enjoy many moments with her family. It would not be an easy transition, but Betty would find things to fill her days. In Poughkeepsie, she had been involved in the choir at the Presbyterian Church and a singing group called Capella Festiva. Plus, she would do some solo work on the side. In her retirement, she would join the choir at her old house of worship, First Presbyterian Church in Binghamton, and share time with the vocal and handbell choirs at the First Congregational Church in Greene. For the first year of retirement, she volunteered and substituted at Greene Central School, where her grandchildren attended. She loved watching sports, mainly tennis and college basketball, rooting for Coach K and the Duke Blue Devils, of course. To keep her hands from being idle, she would take up cross-stitch and even opened a voice studio that she would run out of her various homes for the next 11 years.
you always need a little extra money. And I decided that that's what I would do pretty much for my travel money. And I also thought I needed to keep my finger in the pie of solo voices. So there was a need for it, and I provided the place for that need to be fulfilled.
Her retirement travel would take her to many different places with many different people. In 1998, she would travel with her old choir group from Poughkeepsie to sing in Germany. There would be numerous trips out to Iowa and the West Coast to spend time with her siblings. Many of these trips would become moving family reunions, where they would travel to all-American destinations like Mount Rushmore, the Lewis and Clark Trail, and numerous other national parks.
When we started getting together for these family things, we went to Yellowstone and Badlands and, wow, a lot of places. 2 years ago, we had the most wonderful trip. We went to a place nobody had ever been before. It was Kings Canyon. We rented a vacation home. It was just one of those times, and we went up in the mountains. She was still totally into the exploration thing. Let's go and let's do it.
Time with her grandchildren was important, and she'd make it to many of their after-school activities. For Martin, it was baseball. For Jenny, it was horse shows. When Martin graduated high school in 1999, she took him on a cross-country trip to visit relatives and see some of our great country. Locations included Chicago, Iowa, Southern California, Lake Tahoe, and Cleveland.
I contacted my relatives who lived in other parts of the country and set up a trip that would include places to stay with them, plus things that Martin was particularly interested in, and gave him a trip for that was his graduation gift, and I'll never regret it.
As had been the case throughout her life, the music was infectious. In 1997, Betty took on a job she had never had before, choir director. The church would be Tabernacle United Methodist Church in Binghamton. Like everything else, she would give 110% until her resignation 2 years later in 1999.
Well, my friends, the Halls, were members of the Tabernacle Church, and they were in need of a choir director, and they asked me to post for it, which I did, and got that job. It was a good job. I mean, I worked hard, very hard. I had the adult choir, the children's choir. I started a bell choir.
With her tenure over at Tabernacle, Betty would go back to singing instead of directing. She had sold her house in Greene and moved to Binghamton in the fall of 2003 to once again be closer to her family who had moved there in 2002. She would start singing in the choir at Trinity Memorial Episcopal Church and also joined the local singing group called Madrigal Choir.
The first group that was active was called Motet Singers. They sort of disbanded. And then Ann Cotton invited people to come and sing, and she started the Madrigal Choir. And I sang with that off and on for a lot of years.
For 20 plus years, Betty helped organize an event that was near and dear to her heart, the annual Hayden Reunion. Every year during the July 4th weekend, the descendants of Hallie and Lita Hayden would gather in Nicholson, Pennsylvania at the homestead of Betty's brother, Hallie. This year, however, would have a somber tone.
You might surprise yourself, man.
Warning: when I am an old woman, I shall wear purple. Betty frequently made this claim, starting with her first annual 65th birthday party at her home in Greene in 1996. By 2004, she was living on Riverside Drive in Binghamton. She'd closed her voice studio in June of that same year and suffered the first blow to her health as an old woman. Just before Thanksgiving, Betty was hospitalized with an erratic heartbeat and diagnosed with atrial fibrillation. She would spend 9 days in the hospital, missing out on the holiday. The good news was that doctors were able to control the condition with medicine, and Betty could go on with her life. Her musical life would come to an end in 2007, when she decided after 70-plus years of commitment, it was time for her to fade from the music scene. Early in the morning on March 14, 2008, Betty was awoken by what she said felt like a sledgehammer blow to the back of her head behind her left ear. This caused vomiting immediately. Her son Marty took her to the emergency room, and they said it was a gastrointestinal problem and sent her home. Within 24 hours, things still were not right, and back to the hospital Betty went. This time they did a CT scan and discovered she had suffered a stroke. There were some moments early on where no one was sure if she would live. Betty would end up in intensive care, and her kidneys stopped functioning, requiring dialysis. She would also suffer from dehydration, pneumonia, and a urinary tract infection. 7 weeks would be spent in the hospital before she would be discharged. Her son Marty arranged for her home care with a mix of family, friends, and healthcare professionals rotating to help Betty get back on her feet. She would suffer from weakness on her left side and hand, but within time she was able to function again. The real miracle was when her kidneys came back online, enough to get her off of dialysis.
Initially, it was misdiagnosed for a couple days. And unfortunately, I don't know if that caused the other issues that happened to come about, ending up in intensive care with all those infections and losing her kidney function and going on dialysis. She did realize, having been through it, that she had a second chance for more time.
Betty did have a new lease on life after her stroke. And being the meticulous planner she was, she felt she needed to get her affairs in order. She put her name on the list for an independent living facility in Johnson City. They said the wait could be 2 to 3 years. By September 2009, her name was on top of the list, and she had moved into the United Methodist Hilltop campus. Shortly after her move, she was off to see her siblings on the West Coast. While on her trip, she noticed her clothes were starting to get a little snug, but thought nothing of it. By Christmas time, she was suffering from a severe cough and what the doctors diagnosed in January as bronchitis. It wouldn't be until February when Betty would learn the doctors were gravely wrong. What was the first thing that came to mind when you heard my grandmother had cancer?
Numb. I just think she's not supposed to get sick because she's what's the glue to the entire Hayden family, to me. And for her to get cancer, it's just unheard of. She's not supposed to go that way.
I was very sad to hear that. We had a very nice relationship, and Alice and Betty were such good friends that I knew that was going to be hard on all of us, and it has been.
It being her, I was devastated. We've been buddies for more than 75 years. And so that's a long time.
The thing is, when she called me, she just was so open about it. And then, of course, called me back within the next week to tell me that she wasn't going to have any treatments because it would have been too evasive. And
it's interesting because when you first hear that someone has cancer, it's not usually that devastating of news. I think that it was more when I heard that she was not going to have chemotherapy, that she wasn't going to fight it. I mean, I was mostly just sad for my mom and for Betty and for her family and friends. But again, I think she did it right. If you can do it right, she did it right.
The first week of February, around the time of her son's birthday, Betty was officially diagnosed with stage 3 ovarian cancer and given the option of surgery and aggressive chemotherapy. After careful consideration, she decided to forego any treatment. Some of the factors that led to this decision were the cancer had already spread, and she most certainly would be back on dialysis because of the chemotherapy. She also concluded she had led a fulfilling life with no regrets and felt it was time to go home.
It was her decision. I think that was the right decision. We don't want to see our loved ones depart. I mean, you don't know what the outcome could be with the chemo or whatever. And I'm not going to say that she didn't go through, they say there are different emotional states you go through. At the beginning, I witnessed some things and heard her say some things. You know, yeah, you're going to be a little angry. You're going to show some of these emotions. But it was like once she got over that hurdle, you know, given the sickness, the person we knew as Grandma Betty was pretty much there.
In true Betty fashion, if she was going out, she was going to do it with a bang. A 2-day bash to celebrate her life with family and friends. Her siblings came in from Iowa, California, and Nevada, as well as nieces and nephews, just to name a few. And what would be a Betty party without singing? Can you tell me about your faith?
Yes. I think I've always had a lot of faith. I think my faith has brought me through some things, that unimaginable things, especially after my stroke. If you believe enough in a being that's greater than you, I think things will happen that you never expected would happen. Since this illness, I wasn't expecting to go the way I'm going, so to speak. I'm not doing any God blame or any of that kind of thing. That's not what's going on. It's kind of confusing, actually. But I do have a lot of faith. I just believe that there is a God. I believe that when we leave this earth, we go to a better place. I'm not sure tonight what else I do believe, but I believe.
Betty's faith would sustain her for the rest of her illness and beyond. The last weeks of her life were spent mostly in bed. There would be visits and phone calls from friends and family across the country. Dozens of letters and cards were received to brighten her spirits. Plus, there were roughly 200 messages from her online tribute site via Caring Bridge, which Marty would print out so Betty could read them. Her family and wonderful caretakers were there around the clock, watching over her and making sure she was comfortable. She told me in her last interview that in an ironic way, the cancer was a blessing. It afforded her the ability to say goodbye. It was decided Betty's memorial should be appropriately held on the same weekend as the Hayden family reunion to allow for as many family members to attend as possible. The memorial was at Trinity Memorial Church and officiated by the Reverend Paul Donaker, who had been Betty's spiritual advisor for both her stroke and through the terminal cancer.
Over the course of my mom's last days, she never wavered from the three expressions which follow. The definitions are my interpretation on a lifetime of receiving and understanding their delivery. Thank you, a positive expression of gratitude for your time and effort afforded. I love you, the affirmation that you are very significant to my life and being. Goodbye for now. Goodbye is final, but my faith holds this to be true. We do not know the hour and minute when we will no longer walk on this earth, but we shall one day walk together in eternity.
Lately, I've been listening to Betty sing on CDs from the past, some of them 10 years, 15 years old. What a beautiful lyrical voice she had. The solo I like most is I Know That My Redeemer Liveth, from Handel's Messiah. She believed those words. And now, in his presence, maybe even singing in his choir, she knows the truth of those words. Thank you, Betty, for being my friend.
As many of you know, Grandma suffered a stroke in March of 2008 and subsequent kidney failure. Nobody knew for sure whether she would pull through or not. The recovery was tough, and eventually she got back on her feet and against all odds came off of dialysis. On June 7th, 2008, the best memory my grandmother ever could have given to me came.
I had to really pull myself out of bed and back into a lot of miraculous health things in order for me to go to Martin and Rosie's wedding.
She was able, with the arm of my sister and the aid of a cane, to walk down the aisle of St. Patrick's Church on my wedding day. Though emaciated, delicate, and pale, that was my grandmother, not just living in a moment, but constructing a moment I will always cherish and never forget.
I say very often that there aren't coincidences, that what we think is a coincidence is an incident with God present.
When I think of goodbyes, they bring nothing but sadness and can seem so final. I know you will always be with me, and I will see you again someday. As you always said, there are no coincidences. You were meant to be my grandmother, and I your grandson. This is merely an intermission. So instead of goodbye, I will say I love you, and I'm thankful for the great times, and I know the Lord will ensure we meet again someday.
Would you say it was a good life, all in all?
All in all, absolutely. And I've said this many times when I would get ready to go away, and we'd all get sort of teary-eyed. And I say, don't forget, I've had 70 whatever years. If I don't come back, if I don't make it, it's okay.
It's breaking when there are clouds in the sky. You'll get by if you smile through your pain and sorrow. Smile and maybe tomorrow you'll see the sun come shining through for you. Light up your face with gladness, hide every trace of sadness. Although a tear may be ever so near, that's the time you must keep on trying. Smile, what's the use of crying? You'll find that life is still worthwhile if you just smile. Trying, smile, what's the use of crying? You'll find that life is still worthwhile if you